crisis of the 3rd century. Well, to introduce this so-called crisis, we want to just discuss the situation as it was in the Roman Empire at this time. We need to do a recap on where we have got to so far with the Severan dynasty, but just a definition of what the crisis of the 3rd century really means. It basically, in a nutshell, is when the army of the Roman Empire had various generals that were competing for power. What would happen is there would be an emperor, he would be assassinated, the opposing army would then put their general in power. He would not last very long. Sooner or later they would get sick of him and they would assassinate him as well, and then they would try to place somebody more to their liking on the throne. But none of these emperors lasted very long. To be an emperor in Rome in the 3rd century was a very dangerous job, not something you could readily volunteer for. But you know, the trappings of power and control are very tempting, and apparently this is what they were all vying for. But eventually the whole situation, it comes under control under Diocletian. There's a couple of strong emperors in between, and there are even some very good emperors who end up being killed just because of the volatile situation in which they lived in, which seems a little unfair. And also, while we're discussing this, how was the church getting along? It was growing, sure. There were also controversies within the church. There was problems and suffering under these various generals of the 3rd century, and we're going to examine how the church in North Africa particularly gets along during this time. We begin our story at the beginning of the 3rd century, actually the year 217, because this is when Caracalla is murdered by the head of his Praetorian Guard, Macrinus. And so this really is the beginning of this army headship taking over the emperor, putting him to death and replacing him. And there is a kind of a spiral that begins here. So the death of Caracalla was not too tragic, since he was a very cruel and evil tyrant, but there are some questions as to exactly why Macrinus went ahead with this. Was it just a typical kind of army coup in which this disgruntled and ambitious leader takes over control because he's got the support of the troops? Well, it does appear that this murder was probably a preemptive strike. Now, we say this because, according to the historian Cassius Dio, Macrinus had been given a prophecy that he would depose the emperor and take over the leadership. It may well be that Caracalla had gotten wind of this, and we know that there were some indications of a staff reshuffle. So, given Caracalla's murderous track record, Macrinus would have put 2 and 2 together, and he realized that he was going to be murdered and simply second-guessed Caracalla. Macrinus inherited a troubled Roman Empire, but to all intents and purposes he was an effective ruler, and he was managing reasonably well. But there was something that he had not taken into account. This was the conniving machinations of the surviving woman of the Severan dynasty, headed up by the formidable Julia Maesa, who was Caracalla's aunt, and her 2 daughters, Julian Somaeus and Julia Mamea. Having been evicted from the imperial palace and ordered to return home by Macrinus, the Severan women plotted from their home near Emesa in Syria to place another Severan on the imperial throne. So they organized popular support, confronted Macrinus, and he was subsequently defeated and put to death. Now, it must be said that most of his army decided to support the Severans and deserted him. Otherwise, perhaps, things would have been different. Anyway, the Severan dynasty is now restored, apparently. Only this time, the reins of power were in the hands of the women, Julia Maesa and her daughters. But of course they needed a male figurehead that they could, control, and they chose the son of Julian Somaeus. Now his name is now known to us as Elagabalus, and that's how we'll discuss him. But he actually was given that name only after he died in a kind of derogatory fashion. Elagabalus, it was an indication of the sun worship religion that he adhered to, which was a little bit unusual and slightly different from the heading up the Roman pantheon was Jupiter, and Elagabalus said no, it's the sun god, and this was also a little bit against the grain. But in any case, it wasn't really the main issue. The main issue, as far as he was concerned, was that he was a out-and-out cross-dresser. Homosexuality was not unusual in Rome. Just let me say, there were many emperors who had this, delectation. But the problem here is he dressed up like a woman and paraded himself. He had an insatiable appetite for relationships with men and women. He was married for 5 times. Eventually, his behavior was very decadent, and the whole court became quite disgusted with him. The Senate was estranged. The people were not happy. But most importantly, the army. Now you've got to understand that this is the main issue here. He started offending the Praetorian Guard. Now his grandmother was not stupid, and she figured that she needed to do something and do it quickly. So she turned to her other daughter, Julia Mamaea. She also had a son. He was a lot younger than Elagabalus, but he had recently turned 14, which was the same age that Elagabalus was when he became emperor, and they were cousins. The cold-hearted Julia Maesa had to get Elagabalus out of the way, and we can understand that this was a political move to retain power. But she gave him away to be assassinated by the Praetorian Guard, and this happened in the year 222 AD. He was only 18 years old, and he had been emperor for 4 years. So Severus becomes emperor in his place. But it is clear from this time that the military was preeminent in power, and the legitimacy of any government from this time on depended on their support. Julia Somaeus took control of Severus, her son, especially when her mother Julia Maesa died in 226. So in effect, she is the de facto ruler of the Roman Empire. Now there is evidence that Severus, it seems, had the makings of a good emperor and made some very positive moves and positive decisions, but we're not sure whose decisions they were, him or his mother. She went everywhere with him, and maybe as he got older this could have been a problem in their relationship, but perhaps some of the decisions she made were the ones that eventually led to both her and her son's demise. It's more than likely it would have happened anyway. They were living in an impossible situation, trying to control the military. At some stage there would be a clash, and that would be inviting trouble. And that's exactly what happened. In the end, he and his mother were both murdered by their own troops on the Rhine River, trying to bribe the barbarians instead of fighting them. It doesn't seem that it's a question of bravery of the Roman troops or anything like that, but rather the fact that there was a loss of plunder, and that enraged the troops. The soldiers then elected their own choice of ruler, and Maximinus Thrax is crowned. He was of low birth, and he was not even a true Roman, which is of course totally unheard of.